Welcome to another episode of Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra, Tech's senior writer, and Joseph Addington, our editorial fellow. Although I guess, Joseph, last week we learned that you're going to be staying on beyond the conclusion of your editorial fellowship. What's your new title going to be? Do you know?
I believe I will be an associate editor.
Okay, I'm glad you're not going to be senior editor because that's currently my job. So that would have been bad news for me. But that was very good news to learn that you'll
Not
be
yet.
staying on.
Your days are numbered.
Let's hope not. So today's a cool episode because I always like when we can talk about breaking news. And this week, the breaking news that we basically have just learned about in the past hour or so is that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and his deputy Alex Wong are out. Trump is planning on firing them. It seems like a pretty much sure thing that that's the case, although, maybe Trump could still change his mind at this point. But over the course of the past hour, outlets have started reporting that with increasing confidence. So I think it's a safe bet to say that they are going to be gone. So we'll be talking about that. We'll also talk about President Trump's first 100 days, which Trump celebrated earlier this week with a campaign style speech. And we'll give our takes on how successful the opening phase of Trump 2.0 really was and where things might go from here. I imagine during that discussion, I'll talk about Trump's approach to Canada, where Mark Carney, the head of the Liberal Party and a former banker, won the election this week to become prime minister. And then we'll talk about Russia-Ukraine. I had the honor of representing TAC as a participant in U.S.-Russia Track 2 talks in a Central European country this week. I just got back last night, and so I'll share my impressions and explain why I am a little more pessimistic about the prospects for peace than I had been before. Although, of course, we don't really know what Vladimir Putin and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff are talking about behind the scenes. So maybe there's a deal in the works. Before we dive in, I want to remind our listeners that there is a video version of this episode that you can watch on YouTube. So please subscribe to the American Conservative on YouTube and smash that like button. Okay, so let's talk about the breaking news of this extremely major shakeup in the White House, with Mike Waltz, probably the most hawkish member of Trump's inner circle, reported to be out. We are taping on Thursday, May 1st, a little after 1:30 p.m. I'm sure there's going to be more news on this front in the next hours and days. People are already speculating about who the replacement is going to be. Sumantra, what do you want to say about all of this?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I'd start with exactly what you said. First of all, it is an absolutely breaking news. We don't really have too much of a confirmation as to what is going on, so it is difficult to speculate as to why he was fired or what the timing of his firing was, or whether he resigned or whether he was pushed out, and who might be his replacement. That being said, a few points that I would like to raise. One, Mike Waltz was a marked man. If we remember from the reporting that happened a month back when the Signal Gate first came into being, we saw a couple of things. One, pretty much every media reporting from Axios to Politico to even us, we reported that the inner circle of Trump was already unhappy with Walz. Couple of reasons. One, he's quite obviously a traditional last quarter century Republican congressman. His ideas of foreign policy is more tactical than strategic. He apparently was ill-behaved in team meetings and arrogant, although I cannot confirm those things, but that was what was reported. And he wasn't the kind of, he wasn't in sync, to speak diplomatically, in line with the president's idea of a fundamental realignment in foreign policy, or American grand strategy, both in Ukraine and in Iran, on the question of Iran. We have seen some of that, translate into online debates. You can see on Twitter, now X, the kind of people who are, after the Signal Gate broke open, the kind of people who supported Walz were the traditional hawks in the Republican Party. The people who opposed Walz were the traditional realists. So that was already there. But the primary cause of Wall's Signal Gate problem was there was no denying the fact that the person who added Jeff Goldberg in that Signal chat was Walz and his deputy. Now, The different speculations of how much Waltz was in touch with Jeffrey Goldberg, or how much Waltz was leaking to Jeffrey Goldberg, are something which no one knows. That being said, the very act of adding in that group chat was done by Waltz and his deputy. His deputy, Alex Wong, obviously a classic, Pompeo style Republican. He has been, a deputy for a while, and he's obviously more traditionally hawkish. But basically, the giveaway from the chat that we got was the only person. So Vance was opposed to strikes on Yemen. Hexet was talking about more tactical stuff, but Waltz was like completely gung ho about it. And he didn't really contribute much other than the fact that, saying that, yeah, we should just go and, keep hitting Ukraine and the Houthis there, the Yemenis and the Houthis. So basically, he didn't really have the kind of a realist inclination that Trump would have wanted from one of his top advisors. As to the speculation of who might be replacing him, Steve Witkoff, obviously, as we can all see, is a name that everyone is floating around. Uh, from what we have gathered so far, and from the news reports that we can see, and from what I've heard so far, Witkoff himself is not interested, and that sort of makes sense. If you see the job of an NSA, it's more of a bureaucratic job. It's far more repressed. It's structured. It's designed to be within a structure as an advisory role. Whereas the job that Witkoff currently has, some envoy, that is more independent. It has got more leverage. It is a more traditionally diplomatic job where he can actually go and talk in a secretive way with various stakeholders that Trump wants him to do, which used to be how diplomacy used to be up until even like 70s or 80s. It used to be a lot more secretive in some ways. So I'm not. I mean, if we think, as we discussed before on this show, if Witkoff is the enforcer of Trump, like if he is tasked with the job of extracting the United States from various theaters like Iran and Ukraine, then he would try to keep a job which gives him more of a leverage to do that in a discreet manner, which wouldn't be the case if he's an NSA advisor. He'd be surrounded by people. Most of them might not be in sync with him. They would be traditional career bureaucrats who would tell him, oh, sorry, you can't do that, So he'd actually lose his leverage. So I totally understand if Witkoff won't want to take the job. There might be another candidate, Rick Grenell, who has been in a similar kind of position before, and he's also loyal to Trump, and he has been an ambassador to Germany, so he actually knows how to do diplomacy. And given his intelligence background, he can actually work within the circle while pushing for Trump's agenda. But it is still too early to say. The question was whether Hexet or Waltz would be the first one to fire it, and you, Andrew, have written about it, and others have written about it on TAC, and I have mentioned this in the show before. Waltz was a marked man, and it took a while, a month, for him to go away, but it has finally happened.
Joseph, your thoughts?
Yeah, I still suspect that Hegseth's days are numbered, but Waltz definitely had the much stronger earlier public case against him, and he had the debility going into it in that he was not really a particularly Trumpian candidate to begin with. He was kind of a holdover from the earlier Republican establishment, where Hegseth is very much an outside man brought in for the express reason of being an outsider, and so he has, I think, rather more leeway for the kinds of mistakes that are being, made both by Waltz and Hegseth, as far as keeping his job in the Trump administration. So, not a lot to add. I think Sumantra went through most of what I had pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, and we've been saying on tech right now that, ever since the Signalgate thing first happened, we were saying, Mike Waltz probably will be fired because of this, but Trump is going to wait because he doesn't want to look like the media got a scalp. He wants to avoid that PR. He might have also wanted to have waited till after the first 100 days were officially over before there was like turmoil in his administration. I'm very pleased by this news. Mike Waltz was what I considered the most worrying pick back in when Trump was picking his cabinet and other officials. I was more worried about him than even the other hawk in the inner circle, which is Marco Rubio. Because to me, Rubio, you know, it was more likely to me that he would become a kind of team player. He has a history of kind of going with the flow of conservatism. Like he was a Tea Partier, and then he's always had this neocon thing, but with the Trump movement, even though he and Trump were like bitter enemies at one point. He went down an America First road. He kind of, maybe this is too harsh, but he kind of puts his finger in the air and sees, which way the wind is blowing and then follows it. And he also has a kind of establishment credential that is good at the State Department. If you're going to be leading the State Department, you need to kind of have people on your side and not working against you. So that pick made sense. But with Waltz, one, he doesn't strike me nearly as intelligent as Rubio. Two, he's, if anything, even more hawkish. I mean, and I wasn't sure why Trump went with him for NSA, which doesn't even need Senate confirmation. I'll go a little further than you did, Sumantra. You said that there are some reasons to think that Witkoff wouldn't want the NSA role. I would say even that I think he would be a bad choice for this particular role for some of the reasons you mentioned. Like the NSA, the National Security Advisor is a very inaptly named role. People think it's just someone who kind of sits there and gives advice to the president about global affairs. But really, the main part of the job is kind of coordinating various executive agencies to make sure that the president's agenda is actually implemented on foreign policy. It requires a real bureaucratic operator with a lot of political experience. So Grinnell probably would be more effective in that regard. I think, Michael Anton has a top position at the State Department, but he seems like he'd be a great choice. Right now he's working on things of national security significance. He's leading these technical talks on Iran negotiations. Um, and he's served in a similar role before. He was a senior official in the National Security Council during Trump's first administration. So he's got kind of all the credentials. And also, he has on many issues this kind of pro-restraint perspective that you would want put forward during cabinet debates, especially, countering people like Rubio. So, I think he'd be quickly incorporated into the pro-restraint faction of the Trump administration, and I would be happy with that pick. Kurt Mills, our executive director, made a good point on Twitter that people were kind of expecting Waltz to be fired, mostly because of the Signal thing, but they weren't really expecting this guy Wong to also be fired. And apparently other national security officials are going to be on their way out the door as well. So this could possibly suggest a broader, like, ideological reshuffling of getting some of the hawks out. It's not just personal because Walt screwed up and invited the head of the Atlantic into a group chat. So I hope that's the case. So much, I'll give you the last word. Anything else you want to say on this news story?
Yeah, so for the case of Wong, I have a different idea. Like usually, if you are a deputy of a uh, of a candidate who's like in that much of a stature as a national security advisor or a State Department guy, your job kind of becomes untenable when your boss goes out. Because you have, like, usually the people who work in these positions are someone who's already in line with the thinking of your principal, and that kind of changes the moment your principal is taken away. So I kind of see the reason. Like, I mean, there would have been no scenario where Waltz would have been fired, where Wong would have kept his job. Like, I probably would have even thought that Wong would have been fired and Waltz would have kept his job and gotten a new deputy, but that obviously didn't happen. Clearly, the guy was scheduled to go. On your other point about Michael Anton, Anton to me seems to be a policy guy. Like he's more of a brainiac in some ways than a diplomat. So why he has worked in National Security Council as an NSA would be uh, I don't let me just put it this way. Know Michael Anton. He's clearly a very smart guy, but I don't see him to be like in a table meeting Putin or talking to the Iranian premier and discussing the nitty gritties of a trade deal or a peace deal or something of that sort. I think he's more of a policy mind. He would like be more suitable in the role that he's already in as a state policy guy, which is deciding like what are the basic outlines of this administration's grand strategy would look like. Um, the last thing that I want to mention before we move on to the other topic, though, is people always forget when people talk about how Henry Kissinger, for example, was extremely successful in his diplomatic maneuvers. Like he did more. Even now, like everyone looks at Henry Kissinger as the template of diplomacy. Why? Because he did more in 3 years than people can imagine doing in their lifetime. For example, he took the country out of the Vietnam War. He created the Israeli-Arab peace accords. He started, he opened up with China and exploited the Sino-Soviet, split. So all of these things, he started the talk of détente with Soviet Union and all that. But people always forget that Kissinger was able to do that because, one, obviously the scenario of mass media was very different then. Diplomacy could have been secretive in a way that is very difficult to do now. But also, he was the Secretary of State and the NSA at the same time. The amount of concentrated power that man had with two whole departments under his own thumb has not been replicated since Kissinger left the State Department. And that is something that neither Witkoff nor, Rubio nor Waltz enjoy. You can have a lot more coherent approach towards diplomacy if you also have the Security Council and the State Department kind of like in sync and going together under one single pyramid structure. But that hasn't been the case. I don't think that's going to be there. The closest to what we have got so far, though, is a Donald Trump administration. In a way, because it's so non-traditional, every single idea or every single foreign policy sort of like goes back to Trump and his inner circle, Trump fans, Don Jr., all of those people. So you kind of have like this hive way of pushing a strategic direction that you see, like it kind of like translates and slowly percolates to social media. It goes out, JD fans tweet something out, Don Jr. tweets something out, and it kind of like becomes policy. That is a new thing, and that kind of like makes one optimistic as to, if Trump is dedicated about, achieving a peace deal with Iran, chances are he won't be thwarted this time, like last time, because it's so concentrated and, in a pyramid structure. So we'll see what happens to that.
Well, that leads to an interesting thought. You could put Marco Rubio in as the NSA.
And keep him at state as well? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
I don't really understand if Rubio has actually changed. Like, I share your pessimism about that, Andrew. I mean, he's making all the right noises, don't get me wrong. Like, he's talking about, like, we don't live in a world of unipolarity anymore. But that's all theoretical discussion. The moment you ask him about a specific policy, he kind of reverts back to his old, tried and tested. It's almost like he malfunctions. Like he's like, and don't get me wrong, like
function in debates,
right?
yeah.
I like him. Like he's absolutely saying the exact same things that I would have probably said in his position. But like, I want to see that translate to one policy. Like, fine, if you genuinely think that we are living in a multipolar world, does that mean that you're willing to share and divide the world with various other great powers? Some of you might be your rival. Like, what happens then? Like, what is the logical next step to your theoretical assessment of the global balance of power? And second, clearly he's interested in his own personal legacy in Latin America. Like, that is, I mean, I can totally see Marco Rubio wants to go down in history as the guy who fixed Panama question for the United States. And that is a great legacy. Like, if he stays there in the State Department and just does, that one single thing, history will remember his name. So if I was Marco Rubio, I won't take too much work on my plate, and I just like concentrate on something which I'm really good at, and I'm already doing something, and I'm just gonna go and get that done because my name is gonna be in the history books.
Yeah, and I think he knows that, he could be gone just like Waltz is if he obstructs or appears to obstruct the president's agenda. You remember during the State of the Union that wasn't a State of the Union, there was this odd moment where Trump mentioned that the Senate voted in high numbers for Rubio to be confirmed, and he was like, I don't know if I should trust him because of that. Basically implying that he doesn't trust him because he seems to be an establishment figure. But yeah, I actually feel a little optimistic about Rubio, just in terms of, because as you alluded to, during Trump's first administration, he had people who were kind of obstructing him or slow walking Trump's agenda. And I never really thought that Rubio was going to do that. I just had some questions about Waltz. I'll mention one more thing about Waltz. I think he was really bad at messaging. You just mentioned how good Rubio has been. And I suspect, although this is speculation, but I suspect that this ambiguity about Iran nuclear talks, about what America's goals are exactly in these talks, whether it's a full dismantlement of Iran's civilian nuclear energy program or just a verification program to make sure that they don't weaponize. It might be a good cop, bad cop thing. It might be directed by Trump, this ambiguity to kind of keep Tehran on its toes. But it also might go back to this Face the Nation interview that Waltz did, where he was asked, "So are you pursuing the full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program?" And in my reading, he was kind of in this mode where he wanted to kind of project strength. And so he said, "Yes, we're going to pursue the full dismantlement of the nuclear program." And at that time, it was totally discordant with the Trump administration's messaging. And it just seemed like a flub, like he messed up. And then since then, it's kind of what he said has been kind of incorporated, introducing this ambiguity. I suspect it was just him screwing up because he was trying to look tough. And that's a pretty big screw up when you're the national security advisor and you misstate what the administration's goals are on one of its biggest foreign policy priorities. Um, but I think we need to move on now to our next topic. So, Joseph, what is your general take on the first 100 days of Trump 2.0 and Trump's celebration this week of reaching that milestone, the state of U.S. domestic politics at this point in Trump's second term, any other relevant matters pertaining to Trump's first 100 days? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Let's go ahead and start with the positives then. First of all, most unambiguously positive thing, the border. Sealed, shut down like it's never been in American history. Like, that is 100% the Trump administration's biggest accomplishment. Completely turned around the entire flood of immigration from the Biden administration, where we were getting, thousands of people crossing the border every day, to now, potentially single figures, double figures, very small amounts. That's a huge accomplishment. Everybody said, "Oh, you need all kinds of, comprehensive border bills and all this, various instruments of government in order to accomplish this." Nope, Trump gets in office, seals the border down, basically day one, and it's stayed that way ever since. So, fantastic, huge accomplishment. Um, al- Another great thing has been, the attack on DEI and just discrimination against socially acceptable groups, against white people, men, Asians, basically anybody who is actually successful in the United States. Um, so going after DEI, sweeping out all these institutions, cleaning up, you know, basically what was civil rights law for me but not for thee, and actually turning that around, you know, going after institutions that are facially illegally discriminating against people by their race or gender. But because it's, socially acceptable in liberal world to do that, the Civil Rights Department never goes after it. Even though it's public, it's blatantly against the Civil Rights Act and various other points of non-discrimination law in the US. Turning that around has been a huge deal. That'll make a big difference. And so, sweeping out all this, especially out of the federal government and out of the institutions, dismantling US aid, destroying a lot of the NGO patronage networks that feed large amounts of taxpayer dollars into various networks that promote anti-American, discriminatory policy, uh, you know, gender nonsense, all of that cultural stuff. That's been a huge victory as well. Um, and then, of course, there's also been some somewhat less explicitly successful but very interesting things like the executive order uh, altering the way that the federal government understands citizenship and birthright citizenship. That, I think, was a huge deal just for bringing that concept more into the public consciousness and really interrogating the question of citizenship, which I think is going to be a much bigger deal going forward in the future, as technology has made mass immigration so much easier and at the same time has made questions of assimilation a much more difficult process in many ways. The question of citizenship, I think, is going to have a much more salient role in the political conversation going forward, and the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for really bringing that into the public consciousness. Um, then, of course, there are some questionable successes. Deportations. Uh, it's great that the Trump administration has tough rhetoric around deportations, but the numbers are abysmal. Um, some of it's just hard resource constraints, some of it's judicial interference, some of it's probably just incompetence and not playing the cards right. Uh, you can see I obviously the big media focus over Abrego Garcia in El Salvador has wasted a lot of energy, when it was completely unnecessary, and the proper thing to do would have been, okay, we mistakenly deported him to El Salvador when he had a, writ of withholding. We'll bring him back and then, very publicly deport him to Somalia, since he's still an illegal alien and deserves no protections.
Did you see,
Um,
though, there's been some reporting to suggest that Bukele really did kind of refuse this request to have him brought back. Like, the Trump administration might be telling the truth about how he was deported due to an administrative error, and then, they can't force Bukele to send him back. And apparently Bukele doesn't want to send him back because he's a citizen of El Salvador. Did you see that?
I mean, yeah, it's a question of how much pressure is getting put on and like the messaging. So I'm not going to say that it's all the Trump administration's fault, but certainly at least there's a certain amount of messaging that I think has been pretty wasteful around that. Um, but I don't think that was a huge mistake. I just think it's taking up a lot of air for things that could be done otherwise. Um, and then, of course, what I would consider potentially the biggest, most questionable, uh, potentially the biggest failure of the Trump administration is the implementation of the tariff plan. Uh, I think that, being honest, reindustrialization is important. I'm questionable about the impact of tariffs as a plan for reindustrial policy. But I think the administration's messaging on tariffs has been bad, and I think that the implementation of the tariff plan has probably been bad for whatever purpose you want to use the tariffs for, which the administration has not been particularly clear about. We've already talked about this a lot in other podcasts, so I'm not going to rehash my concerns about that. But that's my assessment.
I like your phrase "questionable successes." That's a great euphemism for for minor failures. Sumantra, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So where do I even start? The three things that Trump administration, well, the Trump campaign constantly talked about was number one, immigration. That was the primary focus. Number two, foreign policy, stopping the forever wars, and number three, trade. And additionally, all of them were lapped around questions about culture and cultural dynamics of this country and what are the kind of things that goes on with educational institutions, changing and reforming higher ed and all that kind of stuff. On the first question of immigration, I agree with Joseph. We have had a total of 8,000 people coming in 100 days, whereas during the Biden administration, every single day had more than 8,000 people coming. That is a massive, success story. No matter which way one says or one frames it, the fact that one can just stop immigration by doing something destroys the entire, narrative of the left that you cannot do immigration without any kind of amnesty or some kind of deal. Like if this is what an administration can do by just enforcing laws, clearly by logic, the previous administration or whoever was in charge, Alejandro Mayorkas especially, didn't enforce those laws, and by definition could be charged with dereliction of duty. So if one administration can do this without changing any structural, change, can just absolutely stop immigration on the border, then the other administration could have done that too. And given the fact that they didn't do it, would forever tar them on the question that it was essentially planned. It was a strategy of getting hundreds and thousands of people in this country. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate planning and, dereliction of duty. So that is question number one. On deportation, I disagree with Joseph a little bit. I always thought that the deportation question would be difficult. No matter what the Trump administration said during the campaign stage. Look, America is a continent-sized country. It is a federalized system with all the judicial, stoppage that happens was something that was to be expected. That was inevitable that it would have happened. Like even on the questions of abortion and after Roe v. Wade, for example, when the conservative was talking about like it's just going to go back to the states. Well, yeah. And then it went back to the states and people voted against it. So, example in Kansas, like the country is a complicated place. This country is big, it's massive. It has the structures in place are designed to thwart unilateral government actions on stuff. On the second part of the question, though, we have seen really abysmal deportation, not just purely by numbers, but also the kind of people. Like we talked about this before on the show. There was a Japanese postgrad, for example, who was, picked up by ICE because he had two fishing tickets not paid or something of that sort. There has been cases where there are questions about green card holders who are technically legal citizens, legal residents, who have spoken in an academic, scenario, stuff that the government might not agree with, and they were either, imprisoned or, in a position to be taken, actions to be taken by ICE. So I'm not really sure if the deportation thing was happening as per plan, but it surely bore your sign. I mean, obviously you can correct me, Andrew and Joseph, but I think it was a mixture of kind of like incompetence and low performance. But some of that was not a fault of the Trump administration. Some of that should have been expected anyway. The fact that he said that we are going to have like hundreds and thousands of deportation on the very first day doesn't mean that that was possible tomorrow. There are, it's not a unilateralist country. The question about what I, always talk, that comes to my mind whenever I talk about this thing is like, we have seen a lot of executive orders coming out of the administration, but they are not legislations, though. Like, what is the guarantee tomorrow that, I mean, the only major act I can think of that happened in the first 100 days was the Lake and Riley Act. Other than that, these are all unilateral executive orders. And tomorrow, if you can do something by the fiat or by the sign of a pen, then tomorrow that can be overturned by the sign of a pen too. Now, one might say that for immigration stopping, it doesn't really work that way because, say, for example, there's a Latin American family which spends $10,000 to cross. That's all their, resources and their money that they have to cross the border, paying coyotes and cross the border, and then they're deported back. They won't have that amount of money to come back again. So yes, there is a deterrent effect, on immigration. Even through executive order, you can manage to achieve a lot of that fact without having to go through legal process. But that doesn't really give you much. Like tomorrow, again, like that family might not come, but someone else might. So I mean, nothing that has happened in the administration so far will have a level of finality until it goes through the Congress and becomes law. And that is something the administration is failing in this scenario, in my opinion. I
I
think
think
more
the
could be
biggest issue is
expected. Was that?
I think the biggest issue as far as the question of immigration, like with the resources that the administration has, is they've really failed to pull very hard on any of the levers available to them, apart from deportations, like, mandating E-Verify significantly more strongly, going after employers more aggressively, and doing things like taxing remittances. So those
Yeah,
are
I
all
mean,
things that
we discussed the
you don't
tax
need try.
remittance thing in the last episode. Like one of the simplest things the Trump administration can do, which would deter, immigration to this country, or at least job immigration in this country, is to, tax the remittance that goes out. Like if you are sending money, if you're living in the United States and sending a whole bunch of money to Latin America or to India or to Asia, or wherever you are, you should pay 50% to 100% tax on that. The moment that cost increases, it deters people from sending money. By definition, that would deter people from coming and having a job here. Same with employment. If you are employing, instead of like going after the migrants themselves, go after the people who are employing those migrants. That's an easy way to deter immigration. There are lots of legal options that is achievable through legal process and through law that they can do through the Congress tomorrow if they want to, because the midterms, for all we know, might be very brutal for the Trump administration anyway, so they might not get this chance again. Um, One last thing about the first 100 days I want to mention is on foreign policy. Given that it's my field and it's our field, and this magazine's like foundational ethos, like it started as a foreign policy magazine opposing the Iraq War. I think on foreign policy, the Trump administration has been the most successful. The very fact that we are on peace negotiations with Iran and Ukraine, and in the process of starting one with North Korea, is a sign of just how different this Republican administration is from the last 25 years. And that itself is a big win. Very shortly on trade, I am not a huge tariff fan, as most of you know. I would still think that tariffs would have been successful if it was concentrated and only against China. But the fact that you are in a global competition with a hegemon in Asia, which controls your entire manufacturing base, while you're simultaneously tariffing your allies in Europe and Canada, to me, it shows a misguided way of using tariffs as a leveraging tool. So I'm not really sure what that administration wants to do, but I probably wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, just as a side note on the question of remittances, when I was getting my connecting flight at the London Heathrow Airport, there were these advertisements everywhere for an app called Remitly, which apparently facilitates you sending money to your home country for immigrants to the UK. So it was like actively being encouraged as a, new streamlined way to do that. Um, you know, I'm glad that you guys connected some of these deportation failures with the lack of a legislative agenda, because this is something that really has stood out to me during Trump's first 100 days. It's worth noting that this phrase, the first 100 days, people associate it with FDR. I think he even coined the phrase. And ever since then, we've kind of used it as we've looked at the first 100 days to kind of, get the temperature for the administration. They kind of set the tone. That's when they have the most political capital. And so they try to get a lot done during that time frame. But originally, it actually referred more to the first 100 days of Congress during the FDR's first term. And, FDR signed like 15 major pieces of legislation into law during that time. And that's why we think of those first 100 days, because basically the economy was being revamped in this, structural, permanent way. The New Deal was being formulated and implemented. And it is really striking that there's been no major bills during Trump's first 100 days. The Lake and Riley Act got passed, I think, on day one, but that I guess it wouldn't have gotten passed if not for Trump's inauguration. But it might have been, like, they were already discussing it. Then there was the continuing resolution. Like, is that literally all that we've got? And it's especially striking because Trump has the GOP under his thumb, like in a way that no president has ever, from what I can tell. Like, they are so loath to stand up to him. Like, they're so supine. Like, they really, I think if he wanted, he could even get them to pass, not just legislation on immigration, and that would really help with interior deportations, I think, because as you say, Sumantra, it is very difficult. That's why deportation numbers have gone down, because they've sealed the border, and so they have to focus on interior deportations to get those numbers up, and that's really, really hard. It's challenging just because the country's so big, and it's like basically easy to hide from the authorities. ICE is now saying they need more resources. Like, they can't do this without resources. The administration is complaining about, the judicial process, that you don't have to have a trial to deport an illegal alien, but you do have to go to this immigration court system hearing. And ICE needs more attorneys. We need more money into that whole process so that we can like expedite these deportations. I think the reason they're pursuing these splashy, controversial, and legally dubious deportations is because of the low numbers. So they're looking for a way to kind of signal that they're really going hard on immigration as promised. They're also hoping that it'll have a deterrent effect and incentivize self deportations, because people will think, well, man, if I'm going to be deported to a prison in El Salvador, maybe I should just leave on my own accord. I mean, honestly, it probably is pretty effective in that regard. Although, I'm not pleased with the idea of sending people who haven't been convicted of a crime to a prison. Like, that's just kind of a baseline principle that I hope conservatives can agree with. Even Bukele, it's been reported. I mean, I mentioned that he was kind of dragging his feet about sending Abrego Garcia back to the U.S., but he also apparently was not totally comfortable with the people that the Trump administration was sending El Salvador, because he said he only wanted convicted criminals. And the reason he wanted them to be sent is probably to bolster his own reputation, but also because the Trump administration is paying him to do this. And that mega prison in El Salvador apparently does, need some funding that's kind of hard for the El Salvador government to procure. I think even on tariffs, Trump might have been able to go through Congress, and maybe that would have attenuated some of the problems we've seen, because that would require some consensus building. with people looking out for the constituents and more aware of how tariffs will impact the particular businesses in their communities. This also kind of shows why maybe Trump didn't want to do that, because almost can't imagine a big tariff bill being passed by Congress because it's become so dysfunctional. Um, and I guess I'll say, Trump's numbers, apparently his approval rating is like 41%, according to CNN. It's a little higher according to other polling. That's like the lowest a president's approval rating has been at the 100-day mark in like 7 decades or something. It's a little surprising to me because I do think, that suggests that a lot of people who voted for Trump are changing their minds. But I will say, I think basically Trump has kind of kept his campaign promises. Like, he promised to do tariffs. Like, maybe people didn't know like how dramatic they were going to be, but he talked about it a lot. It was not ambiguous that he loves tariffs and he's going to pursue them to address these trade deficits. He kind of ran as a pro-restraint candidate. He didn't resolve the Ukraine war in 24 hours like he promised to do, but he is moving pretty fast, to get these negotiations pushed forward. And same with Iran. And as we've been saying, he did seal the border and he promised to do that. So I would say, there's been some missteps, but from a political perspective, I can see why the Trump people, like when he gave that campaign style speech, obviously he's not going to come out and say, "Oh, we've had a lot of questionable successes," as Joseph put it. He's not going to point to any failures. He's obviously going to kind of tout his successes. But I got the feeling that he really was kind of feeling his oats, and that the administration feels like they're doing a good job. But I don't know if you guys want to respond to that.
Well, I think as far as the legislative agenda, the big question is the filibuster in the Senate, right? They can pass reconciliation and budget bills because they don't need to worry about the filibuster. But if they wanted to pass
True, true.
pretty much any other kind of bill, they're not going to get buy-in from the Democrats. So even if you could pass it on a party line vote, you'd have to repeal the filibuster. And I actually support repealing the filibuster just because I think it's the only way that Congress will ever do anything in the future again, and I think that only having the president rule the country is probably structurally unhealthy. But that's a very unpopular opinion, so nobody's going to listen to me on that.
Sumantra, you want the last word on Trump's first 100 days?
I on the question of foreign policy, you mentioned, we talked about how the immigration process kind of like encourages a lot of self-deportation. On people, like people see that there is no incentive in coming to this country because we are going to be sent back to either our own country and lose all the money that we have already spent, or we might be unfortunate enough to actually land up in Bukele's prison in El Salvador. Or if the talks are correct so far, we might have a Rwanda scheme where like we're just going to be in Africa, in a country. So all of those things kind of like encourages self-deportation. On foreign policy, it also has a similar kind of effect. We are seeing an effect in Europe, for example, because of the questionable successes of Trump's peace talks in Ukraine. The idea in Europe is like, look, we cannot trust the Americans to continue to support us no matter what they say or whatever demand they make. So we might as well like try doing something. One of the biggest things that happened in Europe was Germany coming out of the debt break. And that, I mean, for those of us who remember the days of when Greece was tormented by European Union because they couldn't go beyond their quota of debt, this is a huge change. If Germany tomorrow starts spending money and takes loans to spend on the defense, that is a structural change in the European Union, and one might attribute that to Trump's belligerence towards Germany. So that is something. I mean, obviously, that it's in a very preliminary stage, but we can see some kind of changes happening in Europe. 16 countries, from what we know, out of 47, have asked the European Union to be more loose about their debt refunding structures. So that is a change that's happening out of fear of Trump's foreign policy too. We'll see how it goes, obviously.
Yeah, I think that'll be a good segue to our next topic, which is Russia-Ukraine. In some ways, a lot has happened since we last spoke about this topic. The most major thing being the U.S. presented this peace proposal to the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and then to the Russians. And then the Trump administration said, they're going to walk away basically if they don't see progress on peace talks. Zelensky's initial remarks were very critical about the plan, especially the idea of giving formal recognition to Crimea. Putin, in the opinion of many people, is kind of slow walking the talks, and feels he has the upper hand on the battlefield. He's rejected the idea of a ceasefire that doesn't address the root causes. They don't want to stop the war because they have the advantage, so they have the negotiating advantage, and they want to wait to stop until there's a peace deal that addresses what they consider the root causes of the war. Some other things have happened. This missile and drone attack on Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. But in other ways, and I've already kind of alluded to it, not a lot has happened. Like, it kind of looks like exactly what we've seen the last 2 years, a war of attrition, which Russia is slowly winning. And it seems like a peace deal is not forthcoming. I mentioned that I participated in these Track 2 talks. It was a great experience. I can't divulge any specifics of what was said or who said it, but I can share my general impressions. And so I'll just say that the talks left me a bit more pessimistic about prospects for peace than I had been before. The Russians, either as a negotiating tactic or because they are genuinely feeling very confident about their military position in Ukraine and their leverage over the West right now, they drove a pretty hard bargain. They seemed intent on their country achieving, all of its war aims in Ukraine. And one worry that I'm starting to develop is that our stupid policies in the US prior to the war, in particular NATO expansion and the pledge to bring Ukraine into NATO, have encouraged certain tendencies of Russian thought that we really should have been discouraging. Rather than trying to incorporate Russia into a European security architecture that respected Moscow's security interests, I think we kind of provoked the Russian bear. And there genuinely is this kind of revanchist imperialist mindset that many Russians have. I'm not saying anyone at these talks did. Um, I've just been reflecting on their kind of confidence and their like love of Russian greatness and kind of wondering about this subject. And so I am I'm worried not only that the war won't end in a settlement because Russians kind of want something that looks like total military victory, but that we could even see, a few years down the road, this attempt to kind of get this puppet regime in Kiev, maybe even to go to the Baltics next, maybe not invade them, but like, you know, kind of screw up with their governments somehow. I know I sound like Ann Applebaum or Timothy Snyder or some sort of like Bush 43 neocon, but Sumatra, you're something of an expert on Russian aggression. Do you think we should be worried about this kind of thing?
I was gonna say your one visit to a Central European country, and you're like Polish, president now. So,
Yeah. Well,
no, I
I did
actually
live in the I did live in the Czech Republic, and when I was there, I was able to get more into this mindset of people who are like scared of Russia because Czechs really are. But sorry, I interrupted.
I mean that totally makes sense though. I mean, with the rubber, we tends to. I mean, clearly the interest of the United States is not to go to a nuclear war with Russia, but that doesn't really make the Russians the good guys in this equation. I mean, they have a history of brutality in Eastern Europe, which for Eastern Europeans are difficult to forget, and that's totally understandable. So a couple of things. One, I share your pessimism, general pessimism on this peace talks. Again, I don't want to sound to be the negative nanny out in this equation, but I don't really I didn't believe anything that coming out of the campaign. Like, when it comes to immigration deportation, we're gonna have hundreds and thousands of deportations on day one, and we're gonna have like all the peace talks happening on day one. I always thought that that's more rhetorical. I think that than real. But that being said, there are chances of having a peace talks with the Russians. You are absolutely right about our conduct in foreign policy encouraging a certain stream of thought in the Russian, on the other side of the Russians, the Russian strategic circle. You obviously know this, but the Russians don't really have a word for safety in their language. Like the closest word to safety in Russian language is bezopasnost, which means no danger. Like their historical, the idea of Russia is uh, a country which doesn't have any kind of natural defensible border. Therefore, it needs to have buffer states. Otherwise, it faces invasion and encircling from literally every single power in the history of humanity, from the Swedes to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Napoleon, Kaiser, Hitler, the Ottomans, the Mongols, the Japanese. It always has faced invasions from all sides. So naturally, they have a very different idea. And especially in the post-Cold War scenario, we have so many times we have had a good relation with them, but then we kind of like backtracked. The Russians were the first ones to come to us after 9/11 to help us with getting Central Asian bases and intelligence on the Islamists, and then we kind of like kept missiles in Eastern Europe. And the Bush administration, for all its glory, Iraq was not the only major failure of the administration. Foreign policy in that administration was absolutely devastating for future American grand strategy. So the Russians don't really trust us. The very simple reason is the Russians don't trust us. The second thing is, as we discussed before, lack of legislation of this government also makes the Russians think that no matter what happens with Trump administration, tomorrow the government might change and things will go back. And they, given that they are actually winning in the war currently slowly, but they are winning in the war, they have more, escalation dominance in their local region. They can put more men under uniform, meat grinders though they might be, but they can put more men under the uniform than the Ukrainians. They have understood that NATO is not coming to war with Russia. They are not going to send their troops to war with Russia. Naturally, on a face-to-face, on a toe-to-toe with the Ukrainian army, the Russian army is 3 or 4 times, bigger. So they can put more men on the uniforms, and they know that they're winning. They're slowly grinding towards victory in parts of Ukraine. At this point of time, they think that if they stop the conflict, and tomorrow Trump goes away and there's a new administration comes and Ukraine restarts the war, the blame would still be on Russia. People would still blame the Russians to be the aggressor in this equation, right? So the narrative would then change, that being the Russians, look, we trusted and had a peace with these people, but they are still occupying 1/5 of our country and we have to retake it back. So they don't really trust the Americans either. That being said, I also do think that they are miscalculating the moment that US is having. And that to me is not a positive or optimistic sign. I don't think people in Moscow really understand just what kind of a paradigm shift happened in the United States post Trump's election. What kind of changes happen in the strategic circles, in the bureaucracy, in the media system, and how fruitful it is for them to kind of have at least a minimal basic level of grand bargain with the United States when it comes to Arctic, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Middle East. The Russians might be winning on the ground in Ukraine, but they are also not winning in a way. This is not Blitzkrieg. This is not the Third Reich or the Operation Barbarossa. They're winning like one village today, like 10 square feet tomorrow. It's not something that they can show and push the pressure on the other side and saying like, by the way, if you don't stop us, we're going to march on Kiev. They have tried to march on Kiev into 2022. It didn't really work out well. And I think they're miscalculating their moment. It's kind of similar, but in a reverse. How by the end of 2022, where the Ukrainians were on the forefront, on the forward foot, and they were told by Mark Milley that, by the way, you're winning on the ground. This is a good time for you to have a conversation with the Russians and figure out a natural equilibrium. The Ukrainians, given how confident they were, they discarded the advice, and then they went in the reconquest, and they completely failed in the counter invasion. The Russians might be facing a similar kind of scenario. Like, they think that they're winning today, but they're all obviously going to get stuck in some way or the other. And after that, by that time, they're going to lose all the good faith that they have with the Trump administration. Witkoff, who is actually having a decent engagement with the Russians, might be out of power tomorrow. There are neo-conservatives who are hanging out on the sidelines. They might say, like, look, we tried to have a talk with the Russians. It didn't really go away. Witkoff fails. Let's put someone else. And again, the maximum pressure scenario will come back into the forefront. The Russians won't like it. The other scenario that might happen, which the Russians might not like, is even now, the Americans are the ones who are guiding this peace process. It's not in the hand of Europe, right? The Americans are leading the peace process. The Americans are the main stakeholders of the talks. Tomorrow, if Trump says that, fine, we're just going to walk out. And by walk out, I mean we're going to let Europe decide. The control over Europe that Trump administration has now in the talks will go away. And after that happens, given how imbalanced the European Union's polity is, and given how even the the nominally right-wing, reactionary parties in Europe, they are still, bound by their own electoral issues. Europe, by definition, is more hawkish on Russia than the Americans. They just lack the capability of doing something. But without the American umbrella, without the American guidance process in this peace talks, there might be a scenario where Europe turns more hawkish and brings their entire force and puts their troops in western parts of Ukraine. For the Russians at that point of time, it would be a scenario where they put up or shut up. Fine, they have like 25,000 troops, minimal troops, French and British troops on western parts of Ukraine. Shooting them would be a roll of the dice. It might happen that the Europeans think that without the Americans, we are not going to go to war with Russia and move back. Or it might happen that Russians end up in a war with Europe or the major powers of Europe. That is something which also needs to be in the calculation of the Kremlin. And I don't think they're actually thinking through about, being, as you say, driving a hard bargain with the United States. So I'm not very optimistic, but, the move is going on. So we'll see how it goes. Witchcraft is also like really, I think, purely from Trump's point of view, I think a deal with Iran would be a much easier one to get than the Russians. So let's see, like in the next few days.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I agree with basically everything that you said, and a lot of it was corroborated by my recent experience this week. Joseph, I know that you're like a Latin America guy, and this is Russia and Europe. But do you want to say anything about this?
Not really, but I'd love to touch on the Canadian election if we have a few minutes.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who aren't aware, Canada had an election at the beginning of this week, and Pierre Poilievre, who was Polyev, I think, actually. I always mix up the French. Wrong Latin. um, Pierre Polyev, who in January was riding high with a 28-point lead over the Liberals, lost not only the election, he lost his seat in the Canadian Parliament, and so the Liberals will have a minority government there, and so Trudeau's resignation and the accession of Mark Carney to the leadership of the Liberal Party. Mark Carney was the head of the central bank of the United Kingdom for a while, educated at Oxford, and so now he will be the Prime Minister of Canada. The interesting thing that I think might get undersold in the narratives coming out of this election is that the Conservative Party basically pulled the same as they did before. The surge that the Liberal Party got was motivated by left-wing, mostly boomers, who were furious with with Donald Trump's rhetoric about Canada becoming the 51st state and being annexed. And largely what happened is you got a migration from third parties, especially from the farther left New Democrat Party in Canada, but also from the Bloc Québécois into the Liberal Party. Um, and that pushed the Liberal Party up significantly over the Conservative Party, even though the Conservative Party's polling share didn't actually change that much in the election from what they were getting previously in the polls. So that's an interesting consequence of the Trump administration. Is Trump winning in the United States pushed out the Conservatives in Canada, even though they had an extremely commanding lead.
Yeah, one thing that's on Trump's shoulders is how he performs as president could delegitimize populism globally, or it could, make populism really look good. And like this is a special case of that because it's not just that the example set by the Trump administration kind of represented populism globally, but you know he specifically like rhetorically attacked Canada and so delegitimized their populists who were thought to be kind of aligned with Trump.
For what it's worth,
And
Pierre Poilievre was not very populist. In fact, as far as a candidate goes, from my perspective, he was pretty awful. But the question is, does it get any better for Canada? I don't think so. But also, from the Trump perspective, does he actually care about the Canadian government? I don't think so.
yeah, it's funny.
That's kind of it. Yeah.
I was listening to this liberal podcast that referred to Polyev as far right. I was like, that's so ridiculous. um, but yeah, I guess just one thing I'd say before we go to picks of the week. I consider myself a nationalist. Um, I think that, the power and legitimacy of the American government derives from the American people. So I'm, pro-nationalism. I kind of have a critique of like petty nationalism sometimes. I do think the U.S. shouldn't abandon entirely its ideas of being the leader of the West. But I'm basically a nationalist. Trump's a nationalist. I think what nationalists sometimes struggle to understand is that other countries also have nationalism, and you should like be aware of that when you're interacting with them, because you really don't want to incite their nationalism against you. Canada is not about to invade us anytime soon, but I think that our relations with Canada are not going to ever be the same. Basically, like they really don't trust us. Like 30% of them see us as an enemy now, which is unprecedented. I think we need to go to our picks of the week. So much of what's your pick of the week from the American Conservative this past 7 days or so?
I'll take the one that came out this morning. I spoke with the Bundestag German Foreign Affairs Committee's chairman, former chairman, potentially the next chairman as well, Norbert Röttgen. And he gave some very interesting quotes about how the strategic idea in Germany is changing about the United States. He mentioned that fundamentally, he reaffirmed my opinion that the German-American relation is basically the real special relationship in Europe, not France, not Britain, although we kind of like say those things, but basically it's Germany, which is the ultimate prize. But they also have realized that the American taxpayers are not going to forever keep on paying for German defense. But also, on the other hand, he kind of laid down as to what are the red lines essentially are for Germany. And one of that includes interference in the domestic politics. Hint, hint, our vice president going and talking with the AfD leadership. So that's an interesting interview. It's on the front page of the American Conservative. I suggest everyone read and share it. And hopefully it would illuminate on how the future German-American relations turn out to be.
Joseph?
Sure. So talking about the congressional or legislative side of the administration, I will take Bradley Devlin's recent piece, Is the Tax Cut Becoming a Burden on Other Parts of the MAGA Agenda, which talks about the difficulties for reconciling the various legislative priorities of the Trump administration and the budget. It's a good piece. Go and read it.
And I'll pick Here's How an Iran Deal Could Work by Ellie Gerenmaya. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. And she basically just talked about, the state of play with U.S.-Iran negotiations and things that Iran should be willing to do and that the U.S. should try to do to make an Iran deal work. So here's how an Iran deal could work. So that's the end of this episode. I want to thank our listeners for listening or watching on YouTube until the end. And I want to thank you, Joseph, and you, Sumantra, for an illuminating discussion. See you next time.